Well, thank you all for joining our webinar. It's really great to have you on board and to talk about these particular subject this afternoon on classification, which I think is probably one of the fundamental first steps in understanding the regulation of your device, whether it be a medical device or an IVD. I'm really pleased to welcome James Pink to our discussions this afternoon. James is a senior director at the Element company, but James has over 25 years of experience in the medical device industry, including 10 years as a health technology expert and lead auditor for a leading European notified body. He actually began his career as a designer in the oil tools industry, moving into medical devices through medical physics and clinical engineering at the Royal Hallamshire Hospital in Sheffield. His industry experience includes managing product development and quality assurance programs for an active and non-active implantable product companies, as well as looking at combinations of the two. James is a contributor as well to several medical device standards committees, including those which are responsible for ISO 13485 and 14971, to name but two. Of course, he's also involved, has been in the past in a number of product-related standards. So I don't think there's anybody better equipped for us to invite to talk about classification. James, it's great to welcome you to webinar this afternoon. And I know that classification is one of those items where people who are perhaps listening to our webinar are really sort of starting off on thinking about regulation, where classification means, what does it actually mean within the context of medical technologies?
I think it's a great question, that, Phil. I think, firstly, thank you very much for asking me to participate in this. I think it's incredibly important for anyone involved in medical technologies to, understand the basics from a regulatory perspective. And I guess classification is one of the very, very first basics that we learn. That, I think there's over 700,000 different heterogeneous types of medical technologies, medical devices, health products out there that, quite frankly, I guess classification is a means of being able to distribute where we put our major focus in terms of product safety, the risk to patients, the risk to users. And of course, in doing that, we all have to land at basic sort of areas of understanding about how complex something is or how risky it is. So most regulatory jurisdictions in medical technologies have four classes of risk, if you wish, and that risk graduates the more that the product presents potential harm to a patient. So, for example, if we think about a linear accelerator that is providing cancer therapy, we imagine it has got ionizing radiation. And of course, we want to think about that. And whilst, most medical device linear accelerator manufacturers now have got the control of radiation physics to a T, the facts is that is more risky than perhaps a tongue depressor, for example, that is simply very transiently being placed in the mouth and somebody's going to be checking your tonsils. So we have this graduation of risk, and classification is there really to serve many purposes. Firstly, to distribute where regulators focus. We have various rules that are enforced to determine, how much confidence you need to provide to a regulator for a product. So, for example, in Europe, we have 4 risk classifications. That's class 1, which is considered the lowest risk, 2A, medium low, if you want to think of it that way, 2B, medium high, and class 3 high, and various things happen based upon those classifications. For example, a class A would have very little scrutiny by an independent, as we call them, notified bodies or the regulatory authorities, whereas a class 3, I usually say that with the class 3 medical device, anybody involved in the design, development, and obviously conformity assessment gets to know people in the notified body very, very well, because you are constantly communicating with them. There's a lot of interaction between yourself and your notified body. So I think that's really how classification works. But before we move on from that, we also have to think about software as well. And there's with software products, there's also a classification system in IEC 62304, which again is independent of the regulatory classification. As we mentioned, the 4 risk classes, but it has 3 classes of risk: class A, class B, and class C. Again, which is along the similar lines of how dangerous would this software be if it's not built well and it doesn't have any independent controls. So again, if you think about that, if we have something that is controlling the linear accelerator, and it's controlling the amount of dose that you're going to receive, then that software could and will be classified as a class C, as the highest risk. Whereas if the software was merely, recording some information for future use on a very low risk medical device, then again, it could be class A, so there are those 2 distinct things. But I think it all boils down to the amount of energy, effort, scrutiny, the perception of risk that the device presents, why we have that classification in the first place.
I've always been amazed by the fact that the regulations as they stand cover everything from tongue depressors through to things like linear accelerators. It's a really elegant piece of regulation. But at the end of the day, James, who actually determines what that classification is, and how do I manage to go through that process of determining that, and maybe even suggesting those numbers to the regulators themselves?
Yeah, I think it will be, initially everyone will respond it's the manufacturer's responsibility, and where we sit in the regulation it is. The manufacturer presents their classification rationale, it presents their rules that are applicable, and ultimately it's the regulatory agency, the competent authority, or if it's a class 2A or above, then the notified bodies will be looking at that sort of classification rationale. And prior to that, the qualification as a medical device, they'll be looking to see that the intended purpose, that the device characteristics, product characteristics do indeed land at the definition of a medical device, which in itself is quite a complex process of very methodological assessment. So to answer the question really directly, it's the manufacturer's responsibility. However, when we think about it logically, the actual classification rules, the definition of a medical device is determined by, in terms of Europe, that's going to obviously be the European law, the European Commission, and then European Parliament, and of course all of the regulations that are output of those activities, such as Annex 8 of the Medical Devices Regulation, are really, really clear about what you've got, what are your guardrails, your guidances, and what are the laws saying. If it's got this characteristic, then it's this rule. It's as simple as that. So there's obviously a legal requirement for classification, which is derived from the regulation. And then when you actually are thinking about, well, what is the class of our device, then it is the manufacturer. And then coupled with that scrutiny by either the competent authority or the notified body to sort of really challenge, hold on a minute, you're saying that it's a class A, yet it's got ionizing radiation as a really, far out there example. But yes, the classification rationale is submitted by the manufacturer.
So it's a very pointed question then, sort of in your experience, if I as a manufacturer decide that my classification, my product is a class 2A, how often does that assumption get challenged by the notified body?
I'd say 1 in 10, to be honest. I think there's quite a lot of scrutiny around the classification, particularly when you start to go into the borderlines between 2A and 2B in particular, or 2B and 2A and 3. For example, not everybody realizes that the raw materials that are made in manufacture could actually incorporate animal tissues, viable, non-viable. Not everybody knows that the chemistry that they've got, the materials they've selected are going to be carcinogenic, mutagenic, or affect reproduction, or actually have some sort of characteristic that a rule exists for, that it basically says, yes, okay, you might have this device, but if it has these characteristics, go to class 3, and it's understanding those rules, and not every manufacturer does understand those rules because they're not embedded in that, every single day. A helpful tip, though, is to look at some of the guidances that are out there. Over the years, we've seen this as highly complex. So there's, for qualification of the device, there's the manual on borderlines, and that's still continuing to be updated, during the new medical device regulation as well. So you could look at that manual for borderlines, and that will help you. You can also look at the MDCG guidance, in terms of classification, and, previously sort of MedDev's NB Med documentation that exists. Then I'm sure we can put into the resources and references section of this as well, Phil. So, there's those areas that give you a little bit of a bit of knowledge, so you can be a bit more dangerous, in terms of the classification. But yeah, it's probably about a 10%. And I kind of think that if we split that across the particular types of devices, I would be suggesting that those implantables are probably challenged much more in terms of, how those surgical devices will be challenged on the level of invasiveness and the duration and the timeliness of that invasiveness, i.e., is it over 60 minutes? Is it, under 30 days type thing? But also, you'll see that if you drop it into software, the classification rationale moves from 1 in 10 to be challenged to something like 9, maybe 8 out of 10. So it's certainly by type. There's a lot more around the classification challenge, and I'm sure we can go further into that with software in a bit, Phil.
Yeah, I mean, is that a reflection of the innovation that there is in that particular area? I mean, I'm guessing with a lot of product types, they're sort of well-established sort of technologies so that you can find those guidelines and be more accurate in defining your classification. Might not necessarily be the case with things like software, right?
Yeah, you've hit the nail on the head. I think that there's a couple of things. I think number one is that device manufacturers have had this, 30 plus years of regulatory understanding around, we still do orthopedic implants, we still do wound dressings, we've been doing x-rays and linear accelerators since the early 60s. We're bounded by quite a lot of, inherent empirical knowledge around the regulation. So even though we may feel that we haven't read the standard or we've not read the regulations, you've been exposed to it for a long time. Whereas in software, it's only just become something where it's moved from self-declaration to most of the software has moved into a 2A classification. And now we're dealing with companies that are not inherently enshrined in this knowledge and this two-way communication between regulator and manufacturer. It just hasn't happened. So naturally, there's going to be a lot more, uncertainty, and of course, there's going to be a lot more scrutiny around: is it really that? Is it really intended to do this? Is it really being used as decision support, or is it actually a diagnostic tool now? Those type of things really are quite new, to be honest, with the new reg.
So the important thing then, I guess, is to really focus on what you want your product to do, how it's going to achieve that purpose, and then work out your classification as a result. There must be occasions, though, where you've got a product where you could have one intended purpose, but in fact it has another, which might be a slightly riskier proposition.
Yeah, that's exactly how it works, and most medical device software companies, for example, will want to go out with, when you raise an investment, for example, you're going to go out there and say, I'm going to do everything that's going to solve world hunger or cancer or something like that. And it's got all of these widgets and what's its that do all these things. And you sort of look at that as a regulator and you go, bloody hell, that's a high risk medical device that you've got there. And so manufacturers get into that habitual nature of trying to, go for the very best that it could be, rather than a sort of a planned stepwise approach to, okay, let's think about where we start and then build up claims, build up technological features and characteristics, build up our sort of utility and involvement in the diagnostic or therapeutic pathway. If all of a sudden we're immediately, our software is going to tell you whether or not you're going to get cancer, and it's now going to completely replace all of the oncology decision-making activities, you've bypassed all of that sort of safeguards, and you've created a very, very high-risk product. So it's important to, as you say, look at that intended purpose, sort of create boundary conditions around it, and ensure that you build it to the device that you really, you want to get into the market at the certain stages. And that's not always the end game. Don't classify to the end game. Classify to, the market, what do you call it? The sort of the market acceptability and I guess implementation.
Market need, I guess. That's
it. Yeah, the market need. Yeah. The one that where it's going to be adopted. That market adoption. Yeah. I think I was trying to say there, mate.
So, if I remember right, the regulations have almost like a decision tree in them that you can sort of follow to determine what your classification is. But what are the key principal things that you have to think of when, or questions that you have to ask yourself when you come to working out what classification is?
Yeah, well, firstly, what is it? So that is it a medical device? And you've got a really beautiful statement now of what a medical device is. So I always start with the definition of a medical device, and I break it down into its constituent parts. And, if it's for treatment alleviation, is it for pathological process or state, physiological process or state? Who's it intended for? Who's the actual, is there a medical practitioner? Is this a lay person? All of those things are within your, I guess, the elevator speech that you say what your device is. But now you've got to be quite disciplined in that. You've got to think of what exactly is an intended purpose. And a great place to go, just to help you, is in Annex 2 of the regulation in 1.1, where already in that first section, it's saying, well, what's the intended purpose? What's the clinical conditions? Who's the intended patient population? All of those things need to be well understood by you as a manufacturer. And of course, then you can then move into Annex 8, but don't go there yet until you've got a really clear definition of your device, and then extract the erroneous bit or the stuff that's not applicable. If it doesn't treat, alleviate, replace, then take it out. Don't use that wording. But if it does actually provide, a diagnose, or if it predicts, then say it does. Ultimately use as much of the regulatory terminology as possible, and then go through the disciplined approach of saying, okay, what is this thing? Then what does it do? How does it do it? And the how does it do it is really important as well. It's not just the what is it, i.e. it's a piece of software, it's a wound dressing, it's an implant, but then how, which is mechanisms of action. Really, really important part of the classification is to understand how does it actually do this treatment or diagnosis. And that takes you above the intended purpose statement and almost takes you into key functional elements, mechanism of action, principle of operation. Those type of terminologies, really, really important. And you can get that down in less than a page. But be very disciplined in doing that. And then after that, Phil, it's moving it into Annex 8. and being disciplined about, firstly, chapter 1, which are the definitions that will impact classification. So definitions such as surgically invasive, active device, active, I think we've got active therapeutic device. All of those definitions have very distinct statements within them that, again, you can check against that one pager. You can look at it and go, is it really penetrating mucous membrane? Is it really penetrating the body through a sort of surgical operation? Yes or no? You know, and at that point, then you can work through that sort of chapter 1. Chapter 1 deals with the level of invasiveness. It talks about what is actually, you know, short-term, transient. What's the level of the duration of contact? I'm just looking here as well. It gives you the sort of the anatomy and physiology as well. So if you've got devices that are typically you'd think, oh, they're quite low risk, but now now they're coming into contact with the central nervous system or the central circulatory system, and you'll have to know what that is. You'll have to go into your anatomy books and understand what the bifurcated artery is, for example. You need to know that. So ultimately, you know, think of those definitions first, and then once you've got the definitions, you can start going through stepwise each classification rule, from rule 1, which deals with non-invasive devices, looking up here, and takes you right the way to rule 22. So you've got 22 rules to think about against that one-page statement. You know, keep looking at it, keep looking at those definitions, and then read the rules and step through them. And you do have to be very methodological in this. And it is that process. And once you've decided which rules are applicable, bring yourself back to the second part of Annex 8, which is then the implementing rules in Chapter 2, and then look at those implementing rules, because they'll have things like, look, if you've found a rule that says it's class 3, then even if you've got a rule that's class 1, it's a class 3, mate. You know, it already explains that type of thing. If you've got accessories, you also have to think about what am I working with to achieve this intended purpose. So there are things like dialysis machines that you might be making the filtration pack, or you might be making some sort of accessory in there, but now you're part of dialysis, and you have to think about, you know, where are you in that system? Are you an accessory? Are you actually, you know, are you not an accessory? And if so, that may have an implication on the classification as well. Sorry, I went on a bit there, Phil.
No, at all. It's absolutely fascinating. Do you know, the other thing I think I picked up from one of your earlier comments was that sometimes you would determine what your classification is, and that would develop over time as you get more used to how the product works, or even whether you're adding additional usages to your product. So in many ways, it's a living sort of process, isn't it?
Yeah, it's definitely a living process. Now, I would say that as you start to add on more features or more, you know, you might change technological characteristics, for example, often that changes at the qualification of a medical device stage, because that's much more around, okay, we've got a product and I've decided to have all these new features. And if you remember the definition of the medical device, you start to hit more sort of things. Or if you remember, we're talking about the intended purpose in terms of patient population, clinical conditions, that might start increasing. But largely, you should have quite a static set of applicable classification rules. However, if you start to change sort of like the technologies, the raw materials that are in there, it could impact. The other thing is be careful about the rules have many conditions. So if it's this, then it's a class 2A otherwise. And I'm just going to give you probably a better with an example, actually, because we're thinking about one of the things that you've just mentioned there. Now, imagine you're making a device that is helping provide a medicine through inhalation, for example. So you've got a medical device, it's packed separately to the medical device, it's regulated as a medical device. You're going to use it to administer a medicine under a certain dosing regime, and you decide to start with a sort of a low risk dose medicine, for example, with a low risk indication. But then if you start to use a more higher risk dosing regime, or a more complicated dosing process, then it could change under Rule 20 from being a Class 2A to a Class 2B. So you're quite right. You might, as your development goes on, and sometimes this happens in R&D rather than full commercialized CE mark product, you actually go, well, actually, no, this is really accurate for that dose form, or this is really accurate for this type of energy, and in that situation, things may change. Another example might be if you decide, to move away from a sort of the light spectrum into something like, not move away from the light spectrum, move through the light spectrum from something that's visible into ultraviolet and so on and so forth. Now those technological decisions that you might have done really, to get the product to work better, to be more accurate, reliable. It might be able to penetrate whatever you want it to penetrate better. So you've got a better device, but those decisions will now change the classification, because they could do things like change potentially hazardous energies, which is a bit of a broad definition, but ultimately you just have to be careful that movement from one to the other does impact. I'm just trying to think about another one on your intended purpose statement that you were making there. I think definitely the intended purpose may change, and it might move you into other classification rules, but very rarely does it make you move from within the rule. There's only Rule 11. There's only Rule 11, which is software, where I can see that one being really, really applicable, i.e. you've now moved it from decision support, and you've decided, actually, no, we want this to be part of a diagnostic pathway. And what we say at the end of this result, after you put in all that information, or it's scanned images, or it's done something, means it's going to be part of the diagnostic result now. And that would change the classification.
I think it's fair to say that, and important to say, that perhaps when you're determining classification, it's not just one of those fire and forget things. You don't just sort of sit there and say, right, okay, I've now got my product. I know what the classification is. There has to be this sort of constant review, not only of classification, but there are so many moving wheels, and we'll talk in a later webinar on risk and things like that, but how they all sort of mesh together is really quite an intricate balance.
Yeah, I think that's what we call a strategy for regulatory compliance that you'll see in the new regulation, where as you're developing the product, you've got to keep thinking about the rationale for the qualification as a device. And so when you are beginning to change something, be it indications, intended purpose, residual risks, or technologies, whatever it is that you're changing, you're absolutely right. You've got to go back into that classification rules, implementing rules and the definitions to see, hold on a minute, is something now changing? And make it clear that you've actually done that task.
In fact, let's change tack just a little bit for the last sort of 5 minutes or so of our talk here. We haven't mentioned IVDs yet, and I know that when moving from the Medical Device Directive to the Medical Device Regulation, we're looking at perhaps an evolution of regulation. The classification rules that you might apply with the MDD, Medical Device Directive, are very similar to those, and the processes are very similar to those that you would use with the MDR. But I understand that the classification differences between the IVD directive and the new regulation are quite fundamental, almost revolutionary changes. So how have those classification changes, because there are still classification rules in the IVDR, right?
I think we don't have as many classification rules. There were 22 we mentioned already in the MDR, medical device regulation. There's only 5, but there's a lot of indents.
Oh, right.
There's basically, I'll give you an example. Probably the best example is Rule 3, where you've got devices are classified as Class C if they are intended for, and then it gives you like from A through to M a series of conditions, or and these are more around the wording that you get are things like detecting, screening. That's another one, to be used as a companion diagnostic for a part of a medicine regimen, for example, or for human genetic testing. So now you can see that, unlike the medical device rules, which are, look, do your intended purpose, and then it's more about the invasiveness, it's more about the energy or activity, is it an active device? It's more about, a specific rule that says, well, is this for contraception, or is it for sort of sexually transmitted diseases, for example, in medical device regulations? They have these independent special rules in MDR, whereas the 5 classification rules that we have in IVDR are very, very aligned to, right, you now know your intended purpose. That intended purpose statement can almost fully fit into the rule itself. It fits into one of the rules. So still really important for IVDs that you get that definition. But remember, the diagnostic pathway is more about, you have to obtain a specimen. So there's a way of, the specimen can change the rule. If it's in urine, for example, if you're measuring, let's say, blood glucose in urine, as opposed to blood glucose in blood. Sorry, if you're measuring glucose in urine, as opposed to blood glucose, then that specimen is going to change the classification. So again, you have to think quite further into the whole pathway. What am I doing on specimen? Now, what's going to be happening with that specimen? Is it going to be used as part of a genetic test? Is it going to be used as part of, confirming a disease, monitoring a disease, screening a disease? And then the disease itself will put you into the higher risk classification rules. So even you could still be monitoring, screening from urine or from blood or from saliva, and it can change the rules for certain, what are you screening, the analyte itself, or it can change based upon the disease or the condition that you are looking at, prenatal, preeclampsia, or are you looking at COVID, an infectious disease, et cetera, et cetera. So those rules begin to change more around the diseases. They change around the user. They definitely change around the user, self-testing, near patient testing. You have to think about those conditions. And even if they don't change the classification rule, they'll change the conformity assessment process.
Right.
So, you never think of classification independently to the scrutiny process either, or else, that could affect your product to market plan.
Right. And am I right in thinking that the IVDR classifications mean that there's going to be a lot more scrutiny for IVDs moving forward? Much more are being included within the regulation on the basis of that.
Yeah, I think there's been quite a lot. I mean, MedTech Europe, for example, published papers about around 82 to 85% of devices that are currently not classified are now, that were classified as the lowest risk self-declaration, will now be classified under a route that has conformity assessment by a notified body, for example. So we can see that a lot more scrutiny of the classification decision will be made. There'll be no independent self-declaration, and maybe the competent authorities sort of only doing like if you want, does it smell right test? You're saying you're doing a HIV monitoring assay, and yet it's a Class A. That just doesn't make any sense. The blindingly obvious stuff. Whereas, the stuff that's a little bit more technical, so like, we're measuring CD4, but we don't really distinguish what we're measuring CD4 for. Is it part of an immunotherapy regimen, or is it part of some sort of self-monitoring as for some other research project? Again, we need to get really into the intended purpose statements. Again, use Annex 2 of the IVD regulation, because it talks about, is it for screening? Is it for diagnosis? Is it confirmatory? Is it a confirmatory assay? Or is it a monitoring assay? What is it that what does it do? How do we get the specimen? What's the target population? All of that. Do that first. Qualify it as a medical device, as an IVD. Write a good, solid intended use statement, intended purpose statement. Define the mechanism of action, or if you wish, in this sense, is it immunoassay? Is it next generation sequencing? Is it molecular diagnostics? All that type of stuff will be really helpful, that you can then once again go to Annex 8 and step through those rules. As I said, only 5 rules, but quite a lot of information within them.
Brilliant. So principles are the same, IVDs and medical devices, and just to sort of finish off our conversation, from my perspective, whenever I've done regulatory work for companies, classification is really key. If you get that document, as you said right at the beginning, which defines what your product does, defines how it's going to work, what your intended purpose is, it gives everything else something to hang off of, doesn't it? It means you can then sort of really drive the rest of your product development and design, and so it's a really important first step.
It is, and that sort of, if you're a relational person, like most quality and regulatory people are, we're all a bit noughts and ones, and we like linkages. The realities is that there are, particularly in the medical device regulation, for every rule and indent within that rule, there is a direct link back to either your clinical study or your clinical outcomes and your clinical evidence requirements, or there's a direct link into your design, verification, validation, risk management requirements. So, because those classification rules are the first indication of the risk that the device presents to a patient, and therefore there is a linkage to your risk, and then there's a linkage into your design, verification, validation activities through what we call the general safety and performance requirements. So you're absolutely right. Get that right. Get that intended use statement right. Get the classification correct. Know where you are in the classification rules, plural, in terms of medical devices in particular, and then IVDs, know where you sit in terms of indents. And as soon as you do that, you'll have a very clear knowledge about where the scrutiny is going to come from, where do you have to put all of your verification, validation activity and effort in order to be able to demonstrate a safe and effective product.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, James. Thank you for your time. It's been really insightful. I'm sure that the people who are watching the webinar and listening to it really understand how to do that, the complexities of classification now. As I say, really important first step. So thank you again, James, and I'm sure we'll see you again in the later webinars.
Thank you very much, Phil.